Del Real, How Translation Changed History. Del taku reo taku ohu de taku reo taku mahapi Maria. My language is my awakening. My language is the window into my soul. Maui proverb. The Treaty of Waitangi and how mistranslation changed the history of New Zealand and the Maori people. The signing of the Treaty of Waitangi was one of few agreements actually perpetuated by the native peoples of an area, being at the request of northern chiefs wanting protection by the crown. The treaty had missionaries translating it, who actually vouched for the Maori, and the British governor actually respected well to an extent and wanted to fairly and mutually trade with the Maori. They're not necessarily mistranslations, but unclear meaning due to non-governmental nature of the Maori people, and by extension, their language, led to many unforeseen consequences, which were a case of a situation in which no party wanted the exploitation or degradation of the other, and yet the sides of both led into breaching the other's treaty, and the following New Zealand wars led to violence followed by a fading of Maori culture in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The British Empire was spreading rapidly from the late 1700s to 1840, the year of the Treaty of Waitangi. The province of Quebec, which became Canada's after the Constitutional Act of 1791, was a relatively large economy of furs and timber. Many island colonies ceded to the British after a certain little Colonel Tornepo quit his job to pursue his new passion of being deposed, including but not limited to Ceylon, Malta, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Cape Colony. The first European contact with New Zealand was Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, which led to a hostile encounter where 4 of Tasman's men were killed after a small boat was rammed by a Maori waka, and at least 1 Maori was shot by a musket. The next encounter, 127 years later, was by Captain James Cook, who is a recurring figure in British colonialism. He arrived and traded European muskets and plants for wood and Maori artifacts. The introduction of potatoes along long campaigns and muskets, it's allowing deadly ranged warfare with deadly accuracy, led to the Musket Wars from 1801 to 1840. Take note of that. The Musket Wars was a collection of up to 600 skirmishes between Maori tribes, and included the extremely gory invasion of the Moriori, in which the Chatham Islands, where the peaceful Moriori on the Chatham Islands were invaded by the Ngati Mutanga and Ngati Dama hundreds of Moriori was massacred. This shows just how terrible the situation was, and so foreign thinking chiefs understood that this had to end for the Maori people and culture to last. In 1831, 13 chiefs from the far north of the country met at Cape Garry and drafted a request to King William IV for the king to be funding the Bush sent James Musby to act as resident minister in New Zealand. In 1835, he and 35 Maori chiefs drafted the Declaration of Independence of New Zealand, officially forming the United Tribes of New Zealand. The sovereign state was recognized by the crown, but some things aren't built to last, and due to the fact that the British Empire just couldn't seem to leave nice things alone, and they needed more land, they annexed the nation just 5 years later. At this time, the British gave the Maori a much less beneficial deal, but still a decently fair one. The Maori would be given full rights as British subjects and retain their land and their possessions, and monetary and physical. And the British would receive full sovereignty over New Zealand. Now to a figure who was instrumental to the treaty, William Hobson, a Royal Navy officer who had much success over his career. He had enlisted in the Navy before he turned 10, then fought on the sloop Peruvian in the War of 1812. The ship would go on to carry news of the victory at Waterloo to London and be part of the squadron that escorted Napoleon to St. Helena. He was stationed in the West Indies and fought pirates in the command of the sloop Whim, being captured in 1821 but being released after a week of poor treatment. He was captured again in 1823 and made a daring escape, continuing operations and driving to death the pirate chief who had captured him in 1821. While in the West Indies, he was afflicted by yellow fever 3 times and was plagued by ill health for the rest of his life. He got married and lived a few years without port, and was assigned commander of the frigate Rattlesnake, and went to the East Indies, then to Australia, where the Rattlesnake acted as a trading vessel and surveyed. Then in 1837, he was sent to investigate tribal threat to settlers in New Zealand. This is how things stand in early 1840. William Hobson as Lieutenant Governor, James Bussey as Juice, and Rev. Henry Williams were hired to trial this. So the treaty was drafted over 3 days by William Hobson, James Bussey, and some secretary named James Freeman. The treaty was revised multiple times, and debate was again over why of the Maori would comprehend the concepts. After the treaty was finalized, it was translated to Maori by Reverend Henry Williams with a request by William Hobson to make it as fair power. Williams agreed with Hobson because concerned by the activities of the New Zealand Company. As such, attempting to make the treaty as fair as possible by awarding there were many problems with which will be addressed section by section. The first section, the British text sets all rights and powers of sovereignty to the Crown, whereas the Maori one gives Kawanatanga, or governorship, which the Maori knew from the Kawanatanga of New South Wales and from their bio-based literacy. The second section gave the Maori exclusive and undisturbed possession of the lands, estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties, whereas the Maori section gave the Dino right the Gang, which translates to unqualified chieftainship, which is pretty different from owning land. And the second part of the second section gave the Crown exclusive right of preemption, whereas the Maori one just said that the settling along the lines of the Crown would get first pickings. The third one just gives rights to British subjects, which is considered pretty fair to translate. It was presented to a hui, or gathering of Maori chiefs of Manaki, on the lands of Busby's house at Waitangi. After the reading of the treaty by Hobson, he encouraged the chiefs not to rush decisions and said, "This is Queen Victoria's act of love to you. She wants to ensure you that you keep what is yours, your property, your rights, and your privileges, and those things you value. Who knows when a foreign power, perhaps the French, might try to take this colony." With once named, the chiefs deliberated through the day, with one named Rewa, a Catholic chief, arguing against signing the treaty after being influenced by French Catholic missionary Pompalia. Though the primarily British converted Protestant chiefs such as Hone Heke and Damate Wakanene supported the treaty and believed in the joining of the two peoples. The Bishop Pompalia addressed William and Hobson to add a sort of fourth clause to the treaty that states the bishop wishes it to be publicly stated to the natives that his religion will not be interfered with, and that full toleration will be shown in matters of faith. I therefore thank you to say to them that the bishop will be protected and supported in his will, and that I shall protect all creeds alike. The final version of the statement, written down, was "Emea ana te kawana ko nega wa kapu kotat o na ogani o naga wigana o Roma me te ringa Maui hoki a te kaka na nagata higata ia." Or, the governor says that the several faces of England, of the Westlands, of the realm, and also Maya customs shall alike be protected by him. So, with the treaty complete, that evening over 40 chiefs signed the treaty with later signatures totaling 200. The treaty was brought around the country to fully ratify its authority. The other 8 copies were the Manukau copy with 13 signatures, the Maikau Manukau copy with 39 signatures, the Tauranga copy with 21, the Bay of Plenty copy with 26, the Hill Bonby copy with 27, the Henry Williams copy with 132, the Tauranga Alvin and East Coast copy with 41, and the printed copy with 5 signatures. The Maori outcry over the pre-exemption clause of the treaty caused wildfits, or whom some may know as the captain of the HMS Beagle, eliminating the pre-exemption clause for unclear meaning in the treaty, and general bush settlement led to some Maori chiefs starting a set of wars known as the New Zealand Wars, the first of which was in 1845. The New Zealand Wars continued in at least some capacity until 1872. After this, Maori and Peka, or white New Zealand, both believed that Maori race and culture would die out and become assumed. Luckily, this decline did not continue, and in the 20th century, Maori with modern medicine, learning English, but still retaining traditional customs. The Maori still were honored in both world wars and were heavily affected by the influenza pandemic. Settlers. This progressive sensibility stems from the fact that the New Zealanders who were usually immigrants from Europe who had come to escape the oppressive and unequal societies in Europe, and which led to more. According to Stephen Levine, In 1948, New Zealand's first professor of political science, Leslie Livingston, wrote that if New Zealand chose to erect a statue like the Statue of Liberty embodying the nation's political outlook, it would probably be a statue of equality. He writes, this reflected New Zealanders' view that equality rather than freedom was the most important political value and the most compelling goal for the society's strive. After World War II, the Limai language died, but the Kohanga Reo, or Maori preschools, were established due to this left-leaning policy aforementioned. And in 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to give non-binding advice relating to the rather confusing grievances of Maori across the nation related to the Treaty of Waitangi. Since the 80s, New Zealand has arguably had some of the best race relations in the world and been one of the most racially stable countries. Made due to effective healing and were never conquered, but just signed a treaty, a flawed one, but a treaty nonetheless. Thank you.